If only we needed another painful reminder of the devastating consequences of climate change. Last week, Spain experienced one of the worst floods in Europe of this century.
My heart really goes out to the people of Spain who has been suffering from probably some of the worst floods Spain and perhaps Europe have ever seen. It's been an absolute disaster what happened over the past couple of days, and it's truly the reflection of the magnitude that climate change is having on us.
As rescue workers start pumping out water and clearing debris, Spain is bracing for the worst outcome expected. It is with images of towns wiped out by water and cars piled up on the streets that hide the true devastation of the floods that world leaders are gathering in Azerbaijan in just a few days.
I deeply hope that we're going to start seeing a little bit more diversity in the locations in terms of their dependency on fossil fuels. This is the third COP in a row that we're increasing dependency of the economy on fossil fuels. 70%, 80, and now 95 in Azerbaijan.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to follow Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. With COP starting off on Monday, I spoke with two European young leaders from the class of 2024. Lubomila Jordanova is the founder and CEO of Plan A, a software that enables businesses to monitor and reduce emissions.
We need to know that as an entity, we're now beyond the boundaries of what is allowed.
And Heïdi Sevestre, a glaciologist and the Deputy Secretary of the Artic Monitoring and Assessment Program.
We're about 1,000 kilometers away from the North Pole here on the archipelago of Svalbard.
Here's our conversation. Just a few days before COP starts in Azerbaijan, I couldn't think of two better guests to have on the show today because in your very unique ways, you are both fighting climate change. That's your life's mission, if I can put it this way. Lubomila, you founded this company called Plan A, which is a software that is enabling businesses to monitor and reduce emissions. Can you deconstruct this for me? How was Plan A created? How are you doing what you're doing?
Thank you so much for having me, and honestly, incredible honor to be together with Heidi, because being a young leader together with her has been an incredible honor. I think it's not a day-to-day activity to be exposed to this kind of talent. It's really funny that the two of us are together because it feels to me that on the climate team, we need to have a lot of skills in different capacities. So even though I'm not a formal scientist, I always called myself, since 2016 when I kicked off Plan A, a pseudoscientist, because I studied it all. I did all my research of scientific papers to make sure that I understand the problem, to then translate it into something that my skills were useful for, which was a technology company. So what we do with Plan A is a software as a service platform for calculating the return on investment on sustainability for the committed to sustainability and fighting climate change listeners. This might sound a little bit cynical because maybe there's no need to discuss the return on investment, but from a business perspective, unfortunately, the economic discussion is always critical. And we've built a product that really speaks the language of any stakeholder, a board member, a scientific expert, and also a sustainability officer. The idea came after a lonely and really dramatic investigation in 2016. I've been always working in the finance space, and I found myself in front of a lot of confronting situations and information about climate change in a sequence of a few months. And it felt like there was continuous serendipity coming my way, and I needed to act on it. So I left my job, left London, decided to build a company, even though it was definitely not something I was familiar with. And that's how Plan A was born. But I did spend close to 12 months studying scientific papers because I felt like this was a problem that required a lot of scientific basis for anyone to be able to claim that they're actually offering a viable solution to address it.
And here we are 7 years later, more or less. What are you most proud of that you have been able to achieve with Plan A?
I think it's being able to continue because there's a lot of confrontation on daily basis of whether this is a tainted topic that is so far behind in the minds of so many decision makers that ultimately we don't have time to be able to address it. I think it's the inspiration of meeting incredible people like the two of you, like everyone that I met at the Friends of Europe event just a few weeks ago, and having the possibility to know that you're not alone in this, because believe me, 2016 felt like a time where there was no context to why anyone would ever decide to shift their consumption patterns, be it from a business or individual consumer perspective. And I deeply hope that this continues, because it, especially in the last 12 months, it has not been easy. It's been very difficult to navigate the discourse and the narrative, but we keep on going.
You keep on going so much that you're also one of the founders of the greentech alliance. Can you tell me a bit more? What's the mission behind this initiative?
The Green Tech Alliance is a baby that became a teenager without any supervision of adults quite fast. We kicked it off with four other co-founders, and it was always on the side of everything else that we were doing, but it just exploded by itself. We now have 3,500 companies. It's a community that we support with access to visibility, capital, expertise, and I'm lucky to be having this conversation with you now, because we just last week appointed formally a CEO who is going to operationally navigate the next phase of the growth of the community. And we really want to be able to support any company that builds any viable solution to address climate change, and give them the chance to scale, because it was so difficult for planning in the first few years. I deeply hope that no one faces these kinds of challenges.
Heidi, tell me about your work as a glaciologist. How does one go about doing what you do and going on missions in the Arctic? Where does this passion come from?
Thank you, Catarina. And I must say, Lubomila and you, Catarina, it's such a pleasure to see you both today. It's so inspiring to get a moment just to discuss these important topics with you both. So I really, really appreciate your time. But yeah, being a glaciologist is not a very typical job, I guess. You know, I was born in the French Alps 36 years ago, and I was kind of thrown in it as soon as I was born, in the mountains, in these beautiful environments. And when I understood that, you know, as a teenager, that there were these people who get paid to study ice and they get paid to travel to study ice, I thought, oh, that sounds like the coolest job in the world. And so I'm really lucky today to work for the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, one of the working groups of the Arctic Council. And together with my team, what we try to do is to help coordinate climate research in the Arctic. We also work on human health, on pollutants, contaminants. And then one of our biggest roles is also to communicate this science to policymakers and hope that they will understand the magnitude of what is currently taking place and act upon it.
And you are actually speaking to us today from the Arctic Circle. Is that how you call it?
Oh, it's way beyond. Yeah, exactly. We're about 1,000 kilometers away from the North Pole here on the archipelago of Svalbard.
It's beautiful. Just before we hit record, you were showing me the view from your window. But can you describe to our listeners what can you see right now? How's the view up there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the middle of the afternoon. What time is it? 2:30, 2:45 p.m. And it's actually pretty dark. It's almost pitch black because polar night is starting in just a couple of weeks. Everything is totally covered with snow, and I can see sea ice forming in the fjord. I can see beautiful mountains and glaciers nearby. So this is truly paradise for glaciologists like me.
Your eyes are just sparkling when you're talking about this. I mean, through your work and through the expeditions that you go on, you're also seeing firsthand the effects of climate change. Those of us that are not living in the Arctic, we still see it every summer, every winter, with floods, with fires. I mean, I'm from Southern Europe, and it's every year is just an absolute nightmare. But you see it in a very different way. How can you tell us more about that? How you are experiencing firsthand climate change where we are? At one point, you mentioned not during this conversation, but elsewhere, that Svalbard is the epicenter of climate change. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, my heart really goes out to the people of Spain who has been suffering from probably some of the worst floods Spain and perhaps Europe have ever seen. It's been an absolute disaster what happened over the past couple of days, and it's truly the reflection of the magnitude that climate change is having on us. The more we burn fossil fuels, obviously, the more this is going to destabilize our climate system. And today we know that Europe, for example, is the fastest warming continent in the world, but also where I live for parts of the year, Svalbard has become truly the epicenter for climate change. So, you know, globally, the Earth has gained about 1.3, 1.4 degrees since the Industrial Revolution. Here, on Svalbard, on this tiny archipelago, we've gained 8 degrees since the 1980s in winter. So the consequences of climate change, you can see them every day. It's permafrost, so the frozen ground thawing, glaciers receding, sea ice that struggles to form. The weather forecast is very tricky here. It doesn't really work anymore because things are changing so rapidly. But what's very important is that everything that happens to the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It truly impacts the rest of the world. And this is why, we need people like the both of you who really help us understand, the connections between these remote corners of the planet and where we live, but also people like you who know which levers to use to make people not only understand what is currently taking place, but make the right decisions to help us to have a desirable future. So I'm really honestly incredibly inspired by Plan A and what I've just heard from you, Lubomila, because I believe that the private sector, big corporations, have such incredible levers to make a difference. And I also understand and recognize that the scientific community hasn't been really good, I think, at sharing the science with the private sector. So you are, a cornerstone of the connection between the scientific community and the private sector. And now, we fully realize that if we really want to transform society, not only, of course, we need to continue putting the pressure on decision makers, on politicians, but the private sector, my goodness, can really, really accelerate the transformation of our societies.
There's a report that just came out 2 weeks ago that mentions that 44 trillion of the economy are at stake because of nature loss. There's another report that came out at the same time from WWF that is mentioning that we've lost 73% of the biodiversity on this planet. And what doesn't capture my mind, and believe me, it's been a big conundrum because I've been delving into this topic for a long time, and I'm still trying to figure out like how do people forget that this is starting to not only change the statistics that Heidi is mentioning, but it's changing our day to day. When you look at these 44 trillion, for example, you're really talking about our way of using land, our way of creating food, our way of utilizing forests without actually replenishing the land. And that has repercussion effects. It leads to loss of habitat of animals. These animals are critical to the ecosystem that also feeds on other animals and so on and so forth. And without going into explaining the whole revolutionary, evolutionary picture that our nature has phenomenally been able to develop, we need to know that as an entity that is so dominant with its choices in utilization of resources, we're now beyond the boundaries of what is allowed. It goes into the statistics of the overshoot day. It goes into the planetary boundaries. It goes into what I was just mentioning now. And finally, and simply, it starts trickling down for now a few decades into the economy at such visible level. There's no time for any leader that believes that they want their company to survive within the next 10 years to skip effort. It's not about like compensation, it's about actual transformation of the business so that there's no overstock, there's no use of natural resources that actually lead to toxic chemicals being released in the air, and further and so forth. I deeply hope that this conversation is an opportunity to balance out not only the scientific, but also knowing that anything that science has been able so beautifully and in a detail been able to tell us for the last decades and hundreds of years can be translated in the mind of a decision maker as the alarm that confirms that their business is at stake.
And that's why it was so important for me to have both of you in this conversation today. And something that does stand out to me while speaking to you both, and hearing and watching videos and interviews from both of you, is your optimism when you're communicating about climate change. That is the most pressing issue that the humanity is facing, without a doubt. And it really surprises me because both of you can communicate very clearly the urgency of the issue, not only with numbers, but through your work and describing what you're working with. Lubomila, how do you maintain your optimism while keep working? You also mentioned that Plan A started because in 2016 you started to feel this sense of despair, maybe. How 7 years later, how do you work with that?
One of the key elements of existence is finding your purpose. I truly believe that if you study yourself to the deepest levels, by exploration, by learning your traits, and also understanding maybe where you're not at your full capacity, you start quite quickly seeing that you're always drawn to the same topics. You're always drawn to the same. I've always been obsessed as a child, since I was a child, by animals. And I always secretly tell people that the true reason why I'm working on climate change is because of animals, because I don't think that they have an advocate that stands out for them. Finding your purpose comes with responsibility. You can't give up. I would find it desperately sad if I have to just draw the line and find another job that is being a clerk in an industry that doesn't give me this fulfillment. And it just keeps on going. You just feed the curiosity with more information and you keep on the fighter mode.
And you have a soft spot for lemurs, right? Why is that?
So, like, I'll just give one odd fact about them. Depending on the level that they have in the hierarchy of the lemur family, because they move in families, they're allowed to sing in different voices. So, like, once you go climb up the ladder, you then can sing in a particular voice. Might sound like a totally unequal society, but they have all these like really odd elements to their existence that I found fascinating. They're also in Madagascar, and they're also 98% going extinct for all of the different types of cousins that they have. And it's due to deforestation, illegal logging.
Heidi, a very important part of your work that you do is also communicating with children and with teenagers. You go to schools and you communicate climate change. And the reality is that the younger children that you speak to, the harsher the consequences are going to be for them. I mean, my question for you is also the same. How do you maintain your optimism, and how do you communicate climate change to kids that had nothing to do with the world that we're living in now, but they are going to be the ones facing the consequences?
Yeah, science communication has truly become a huge part of my life. I try to make sure that our science has the impact it deserves. So I'm speaking to corporations, to governments, to civil society, but there are these really precious nuggets, these really rare moments when I get the chance to speak with the younger generations. And my goodness, yeah, it's very tough because the few of them who really understand the importance of what's currently taking place, some of them truly believe it's the end of humanity, that this is the end of the world. And truthfully, when we see how bad the consequences of climate change are at 1.3, 1.4 degrees, and we're heading straight to an increase of 3 degrees by the end of the century, I totally get, why they start to feel this way. So there is a ton of climate anxiety among the younger generations, but also, let's not generalize it here, there are also those who just want to become influencers in Dubai and drive Lamborghinis. I mean, different life choices here. And so my job is to really help them understand that of course it's not their fault. Of course, it's not up to them to fix all the issues we have created. First of all, it's up to us, the adults, their parents, their teachers, the director of their school. This is truly up to us to really make a difference today. But eventually, we will need them. And I often tell them that at the moment, what we need from them is we need their voices. We need them to tell us how they feel. We need them to tell us what they want to see, the change they want us to truly implement today. But eventually, they will have to make a decision on the job, on the career they want to undertake. They will have to make a decision on who to vote for when they turn 18. And so eventually, they will need to understand that the world will be continuing to change really rapidly, and it will be their own decision to fight for what's right, to fight for the animals, to fight for the glaciers, to fight for a better future, to fight for equality. So that's what I try to make them understand. And what I've noticed every time I go to a school is how fantastic their ideas are. They know exactly what can be changed. They know exactly what can be improved. And there's nothing worse, I believe, for a kid who is, 14 in 2024, to have all these dreams and aspirations and to hear the adults tell them, stop dreaming. This is too ambitious. This would never happen. No, it's up to us, the adults, to make sure that we make these ideas become reality. So this is, a core that I like to share to the parents, to the teachers. Listen to what the kids are telling us. Even sometimes it doesn't make us very happy because it's forcing us to change our ways. But it's our duty to listen to their ideas and make them become reality, if as long, of course, as they help us make a better future.
It is very clear for both of you the passion that you have for work that you do. It's the main driver, Lubomila. That's what you said, that it is what gets you going. But Heïdi, is it the same for you? Is it a passion for ice and for the work that you do that stops you or prevents you from falling into climate anxiety and still maintaining optimism?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Lubomila on this topic that once you know, you never go back. You can never go back. Once you know how big the mountain we have to climb is, but also how many solutions levers exist, you cannot slip back. You just continue pushing forward. And what truly gives me optimism today is, a moment like the one we're having right now, is meeting all these climate warriors, all these people who, wherever they are, no matter what they do, not only educate themselves on the science of climate change, but use the tools they have at the scale they have with the network they have to make a difference. And truly today, I get to do this very often, to go to companies, to go to different regions in Europe, and you really start to notice that a massive change is coming, and a massive change for the better, which doesn't mean that, I'm fully optimistic about what's happening at the moment. I think the consequences of climate change are becoming stronger, more destructive, more costly. And I think it's very important that we, civil society, the private sector, show that we can make a difference. And eventually governments will start to realize that they also have to help us do that. It feels that governments in Europe haven't totally grasped, I think, the change or the magnitude of climate change, but we will help them to quickly understand that we also need the bottlenecks, the regulations to help us to make a change.
Why do you say that you see that a drastic change is coming? Where do you see that?
Oh, everywhere. In every territory, every company, every school I travel to, I see more and more people who understand what's happening, but most importantly, people who act, people who create collaborations to really start changing their company, their territory, their school, their city, their town. It's completely different from where we were 5 years ago. So that gives me a lot of hope. But again, we can only go so far if governments don't help us with encouragement, subsidies, tax advantages. It will be very, very difficult. And regulations, of course. At least civil society is, most of us pedal to the metal at the moment, for sure.
Lubomila, I saw you nodding just now. Do you agree, I guess?
I see a different angle, but the outcome that Heïdi is mentioning is the same. Ultimately, stakeholders are aligned to the fact that there's a problem that exists. There's different approaches to how to address it, which is still adding a lot of problems, I would call it. But the truth is that for the last 2 years, there's a lot of bubbling activity that demonstrates that corporates are awakening, the employees within these corporates are gathering a common voice. And finally, consumers are starting to be more educated in terms of making their choices. I have been incredibly happy to see also legislation changing towards action rather than only reporting, which historically has been the case. There's greenwashing laws going directly against companies that claim that they're doing something sustainable. And there's also legislation like CSRD coming from the European Union, where you're not only asking how did you perform last year, but also how are you going to adapt in the coming years. And there's an anticipated set of penalties that are coming out of this. We need to get to a point where there's alignment between all these actions so that there's no shouting on the streets while in the corporate meeting rooms and in the boardrooms there's panic and ultimately action that maybe is misaligned in terms of the expected outcomes for society. But I'm deeply hopeful that this time is coming very quickly, and all of the approaches that have been taken historically that were not based in science and also were based purely of the hope to make some money because now this is a hyped topic will be eliminated because we simply don't have time for abundance of choices that are not validated by the truthfulness to their contribution.
And speaking of time is coming. Time is coming also for COP. By the time we launch this episode, COP will be just one weekend away. I'm curious, are you both planning on following it somehow, even being there or following the news?
I will be giving a keynote thanks to the invitation of the UN. I am not yet confirmed if I'll be physically there. I deeply hope that we're going to start seeing a little bit more diversity in the locations in terms of their dependency on fossil fuels. This is the third COP in a row that we're increasing dependency of the economy on fossil fuels, 70%, 80, and now 95 in Azerbaijan. That doesn't mean that there's no willingness to transition by these economies, but there's a different perspective that you can learn about if you are in a place which is actually dependent on the stability and strength of nature without maybe pumping oil out of the ground.
Heïdi, are you planning on attending COP?
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll be there during week one, and we have quite a series of events to participate in and to lead in order to share the science and really the latest scientific findings to decision makers, to climate negotiators. But I'm starting to be increasingly, of course, as many of us, frustrated about COPs. I do believe it's incredibly important to have, the biodiversity COP, the climate COP, to bring everyone around the table to really make strong decisions and ambitious plans to fight climate change. But the way COPs work is not strong enough at the moment. If we continue making decisions based on consensus, it only takes, one stakeholder, one country to remove certain language from the decision text. Also, these are non-binding agreements. I mean, at least that's what most of us believe. So it's not really encouraging. I remember seeing a few years ago, Bolsonaro, for example, signing agreements about deforestation when he was pedal to the metal, and he understood that it was non-binding, so he didn't really care about, signing these agreements. Didn't make any difference for him. So I believe that we need a bit of a COP revolution. We really need to change the way decisions are being made. And I totally agree that we need more diversity. We need to hear all the voices, and especially we need to hear the youth. This is very important at this COP. So it's incredibly important to have the presence of civil society during these COPs. I think, to me, this is what truly makes a huge difference. But the way they are run at the moment, I think, is reaching its own limits.
There is a beauty in the idea that in one place, the whole planet is represented. This whole idea that every single nation is physically in one spot, and you have the possibility to speak to each other, learn from each other's customs and visions and concerns. We don't utilize strongly enough that. And that's, I believe, Heïdi, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, but at least this is how I get inspired by the words that you're saying. We need to be able to better translate the message that comes from one place to another to make sure that this one home that we all have is healthy across the board, because climate change is created universally across the board. It doesn't matter if the emissions are from China, the US, India, or another place. The suffering on the other end, if we continue with the same trajectory of temperature increase, will be felt everywhere, starting with the global south.
What would be for you best outcome possible that you can imagine for COP?
They call it the finance COP, and as a person that works extensively with different banks, knowing how challenging their job is, both to decarbonize their own asset mix, but also to lead this transformation by educating their own clients to start going on this transformation journey. I deeply hope that financial institutions would understand the opportunity lying in decarbonization financing and enabling this working capital across the board, because any minute lost down the line is actually costing, at this point, the estimation is like a few thousand times more. If we pay now for an action to be taken on, let's say, recycling e-waste or eliminating toxic materials, we have the possibility to pay a lower cost. And I think banks are at the core of this.
Heïdi, if the sky's the limit, what would be for you the best outcome from COP?
First of all, I totally agree with what Lubomila just said. It's incredibly important that this is a finance COP, and to understand that the cost of inaction is so much greater than the cost of investing in the fight on climate change is crucial. I think, to be honest, if there is one sentence that we should share with everyone, is what you've just said, Lubomila. for everyone to understand that, fighting climate change is an investment in the future, truly, and it's so much cheaper than just paying for the repairs. But to me, as a glaciologist, we're going to try to raise the importance of the cryosphere, so all the snow and ice regions in the world, and we're starting to realize that there are certain tipping points in the climate system that we, at the moment, really cannot afford to cross. And these tipping points start around 1.5, 2 degree of temperature increase, and we cannot give up on these really ambitious climate goals. So that means we need to see a phase out of fossil fuels, not just a phase down. We'll continue to push on the phase out and to make sure that we do not give up on the 1.5 degree goal, even though it's going to be very, very hard. The window is still open, and it's up to us to decide today in 2024, how bad do we really want this?
I can't wait to hear back from both of you on how it was to be at COP, and I'm sure that's just from the fact that you're both going to be there, there's still hope. There's hope left. I can't thank you enough, Heïdi and Lubomila, for taking the time to speak with me today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, likewise. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You just heard from two European young leaders from the class of 2024, Lubomila Jordanova, the founder and CEO of Plan A, and Heïdi Sevestre, glaciologist and the Deputy Secretary of the Artic Monitoring and Assessment Program. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn and X, or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.